So this first idea is the idea of the architect as detective. There are many models for the architect. In a kind of perhaps pre-20th century, there was the model of the architect as artist. There's the model of the architect as scientist. I would say that in an era of climate change, there is also the model of the architect as superhero who will somehow redress social and environmental imbalances. But the one that we have perhaps gotten most interested in is the idea of the architect as detective. And so then the question is, well, what kind of detective might one be? There's Columbo, who has a kind of wry sense of humor and who tricks his people into revealing the answers. There's Magnum PI, who makes it look all perhaps too easy. We decided that seemed antithetical to the practice of architecture. And then there's Morgan Freeman from The Wire, and we've sort of settled upon him as a perhaps apt model for the architect. He begins his career in the show in the first season. He had a kind of flourishing career. He gets relegated to the basements of the investigative units for having asked questions that people didn't want to have asked publicly, and then sees his career essentially resuscitated during the course of that first season because he's such a good detective and because he's able to be so thorough and broad about the way he goes about it. And he famously says in that first season, you follow the drugs, you get the drug addicts and the drug dealers, but you start to follow the money and you don't know where the F it's going to take you. And this idea, I think, of following the money is perhaps productive and apt for the architect as someone who, I would argue, increasingly needs to look for what is perhaps latent and not obvious, and look for relationships between systems and often outside of the actual field of architecture to reveal opportunities that have perhaps hitherto been untapped. So this, I would say in many ways, our own practice follows a kind of similar trend of detective work. We are, as Mari said, a practice founded with Mason White in 2003. We both teach. I teach at Waterloo. Mason teaches at the University of Toronto. In 2009 or 2008, actually, we founded Infonet Lab, which was really a kind of research branch of Lateral with two other colleagues. In a year later, we decided to start a journal called Bracket, which we take turns co-editing. So there are always two of us, and we sort of pair up in different ways. And in a way, and Infonet, if Lateral is a kind of design practice, Infonet sees itself primarily as a kind of vehicle for research, whether it's through curation, through writing, through organizing conferences. And in a way, all these kind of branches are different modes of investigation and different modes of research and different modes of design. And so, insofar as I would say, any act, whether you're curating, whether you're writing, you're constructing an argument, you're taking a position, hopefully, on the field in which you're operating. So I'm going to talk very, very quickly about Bracket, which is the journal that we have. We are now editing our 3rd issue and launching a call in the new year for the 4th issue. And Bracket really began, the subtitle is Architecture, Environment, and the Digital Culture. And it really aims to look very broadly at the discipline of architecture and design and landscape. And it sort of grew out of a perhaps frustration with the current publishing field, that there sort of seemed to be two models of journals. There was the kind of glossy design journal, which often seemed to publish familiar faces. And then there was the kind of highly scholarly journals, which on the one hand also sometimes seem to publish familiar faces. But the question of how sort of practice and theory and speculation might all meet and intersect seemed to be kind of maybe somewhat absent in the field of publishing, and hence the launch of Bracket. And so we purposely actually called it, I shouldn't call it a journal because we've actually called it an almanac, in the idea that it is forecasting. So it's less documenting what is right now and more projecting on where we might be going as a profession and as a discipline. And so, of course, the idea of the Farmer's Almanac is one that is predictive. It looks at environment, it looks at climate, and it predicts harvests and yields. And so we like this idea of architecture as predictive, and this is, you'll see a kind of recurrent theme in a way through all of our work. So the first issue of Bracket was called On Farming, and it looked at farming not simply in the kind of conventional sense of farming, but in the idea of any enterprise that that harvests, that collects, that is productive in a sense. So it could be harvesting energy, harvesting food, harvesting resources, and so forth. And so this was the kind of first issue published by ACTAR that came out in 2010. We invite an editorial board for every issue that rotates. So the idea is that there is a kind of fresh set of voices selecting the projects. And really the ambition of the journal is to publish for the most part fairly young and less known architects. So there's often, there's some student work or there's work of very young designers that are just emerging. So in the issue of On Farming, we sort of categorize the projects according to 6 themes, and I'm not going to really talk about the individual projects, but to give you a sense. And so there's a combination of both essays and projects, and many that kind of sit in a productive sort of hybrid in between. I can scroll through. So this was a project looking at a kind of form of aqua farming. The second issue, so Mason and Maya Przybylski edited the first. I edited the second with Niraj Bhatia, who now teaches at the California College of Arts. And that one was called Bracket Go Soft, and it looked at the idea of soft systems, the idea of could architecture and infrastructure be responsive, be adaptable, and able to kind of, rather than kind of single function, and so the idea of going soft pertained to kind of environmental questions. It pertained to sort of political. I mean, one can think of soft politics. And so again, projects were kind of classified according to different ideas. So the idea of sensing and feedback, the idea of interfacing, the idea of subverting and hijacking, the idea of formatting and distributing, and so forth. So for instance, one of the projects was looking at land generation in Chicago, collecting sediment off Lake Michigan to form new land. One project was looking at toxicity and how it was measured and how it could be made legible to a community that was along the the Mississippi and Louisiana, where there's high levels of toxicity. One project from actually a student at Waterloo who was looking at the role of ecology as a kind of potential ally in subverting the kind of political relationships between the Palestinian and the Israeli, so looking at a kind of soft politics through ecology. So looking at beekeeping as colonizers, looking at trash as a kind of way to recolonize the landscape, and so forth. So it's more to give you a sense of perhaps the kind of tone and feel and ambitions of the project. And so the most recent one that we're currently editing is called Bracket at Extremes, and looks at the question of can conditions of imbalance be actually productive? So can conditions of instability, whether environmental, political, ecological, rather than perhaps our kind of traditional intuition of wanting to redress them and make them go back to some normative state, can one actually harness the sort of instability for productive uses, in a sense. So that one will come out in March of 2014. So the next idea that I want to talk about is an idea of post-natures. And we've been interested for a long time, I would say, in the kind of dialectic between architecture and nature, which are have sometimes been seen as sort of oppositions. The landscape historian William Cronin argues that all nature is constructed, or at the very least mediated by human presence, such that wilderness cannot be understood as something separate from human intervention. Over the course of the 20th century, what I would call post-natures have been evolving, which expands both the scale and complexity of this mediated nature. There are new landscapes, both interior and exterior, which are not simply harnessed for their agricultural or mineral or hydrological resources, but are calibrated, controlled, mechanized, and monitored to the point that one might argue that they have become mutant or synthetic natures. From the territorial to the nanoscale, mutant environments which fuse the natural and the artificial, the technologic, and the infrastructural have been proliferating across our globe. Natures are monitored and controlled, ecologies are amplified and manufactured, and interior landscapes are conditioned with the intent of augmenting performance and responsiveness or controlling the flow of resources. In this current scenario, the dialectic is no longer nature versus city or nature versus artificial, but positions within a spectrum of mediation and manipulation of nature, landscape, and the built environment. And one of the people that has been, I would say, influential and I think of great interest is someone called Carrie Wolf, who is essentially a philosopher. He teaches English actually at Rice University, I believe. And he writes in his book, What is Posthumanism? He proposes this idea of posthumanism that serves to challenge our anthropocentric understanding of the world, questioning the role and hierarchy of the human in relation to other environmental paradigms. And so he's really sort of arguing that we need to consider species, whether animal species or ecologies, as equal in the kind of environmental equation. And one of the people that he invokes in this discourse is someone called Temple Grandin, who is an author who's significant both for her writings on disability studies, particularly on autism, and also her animal studies. Both fields which are in fact credited for sort of reshaping or contributing to this field of posthumanism. And so she writes a lot, but she also, in her animal studies, did some projects that really looked at how design might be specifically calibrated to animals. So this is a project that she was doing for cattle herding structures that are going to be led to an abattoir. And what's interesting is her argument was, you know, the cattle are going to be slaughtered. I'm not here to stop that, but how can there be an architecture through its geometry, through the way the animals move, that reduces their stress, that sort of transforms the kind of animal experience? And so I think this question that there is an architecture that might be uniquely calibrated to a species that is very different than how one calibrates for a human is interesting. And of course, there's a kind of whole spectrum of architects looking at questions of animals in architecture. There's the strand of people looking at biomimetics. So for instance, Iwamoto Scott, for instance, in the Jellyfish House, where they're looking at how the patterns or the performance of animals as metaphors. There's people like Joyce Wang in Buffalo, who has been designing bat habitats. And I guess where our interest lies is in saying, what would be an architecture that starts to serve both humans and species, and what infrastructures might start to address both? So I'm going to very quickly talk about a project that's already a few years old now called Water Economies, Ecologies, that was looking at water infrastructure in the American Southwest. And it, in many ways, I think, set the stage for a lot of our recent interests. So it began with an observation about access to water resources in the US, and an observation that despite having 6.5% of the freshwater resources of the world, many cities were undergoing severe drought and water shortages. And that is in large part because many of the fastest growing cities in the US are in fact located in the most water-strapped regions. And so this map makes it clear, where you see places like San Diego, Las Vegas, parts of Florida, in regions that have actually little access to water. And so the consequence of that has been huge water infrastructures that have been constructed to transport water from water-rich regions to cities that effectively, one might argue, should not be being built in the desert, that they're entirely artificially sustained through these infrastructures. And so this, actually, I'm just going to go back. So this is a map. We started to kind of zero in on the Colorado River watershed and Colorado River basin because it's one of the most infrastructuralized, in a sense, basins in America. There isn't a mile virtually that hasn't been either dammed, pumped, put into canals to deliver water and so forth. And so here you see some of the kind of infrastructures that are being deployed throughout that region. And so then the question became, what is happening to the kind of landscapes that are either sustained or produced by this infrastructure? And are they at this point nature, in the kind of in how one might traditionally understand them. And one of the regions that has become perhaps a kind of litmus test for the impacts of the manipulation of nature and hydrology is the region around the Salton Sea, which you see in this map. And the Salton Sea is really an entirely artificial production. It was created in 1905 when, as they were building the water canal, the dams broke, the water flooded a kind of ancient inland sea and basically created the Salton Sea. And it is what is known as a terminal lake, which means it has no natural outlet. So the water doesn't flow out. It flows in from two rivers that you see highlighted in blue. One is the New River and one is the Alamo River. But basically, because it has no outlet, it gets more and more salinated, and so that has environmental repercussions that I will talk about. But the other thing that's interesting about it is it was essentially at the time designated as an aqueous dump, which means that there's a huge agricultural region called the Imperial Valley, which produces about 1/10 of all the agricultural produce in America. And basically all the water with the fertilizers and pesticides wash off into the Salton. So you can imagine that Salton Sea is concentrating constantly pesticides and salinity, which is happening both naturally and through assorted chemicals. And so it has produced a kind of truly mutant landscape. In the 20s, it was actually the kind of playground of the California movie stars. It had regattas because of the high salinity, made boats go faster. It had all sorts of hotels and so forth. And then in the 1950s, as these environmental issues started to concentrate, there was huge fish die-off. So this is and I'll come back to this. So this is the Imperial Valley, which is entirely sustained by a set of, it looks really like the Dutch landscape. It's entirely sustained by a set of complex water canals. And so as the as the lake started to concentrate in toxins, there started to be huge fish die-off, and so the tourism industry collapsed, which you see evidence of here. This is these massive fish die-offs, the birds got sick and so forth. And so the question has been for now probably several decades, how to somehow salvage the Salton Sea. And so there have been many engineering proposals, which you see here, which largely said, let's dam part of it, let half of it die off and try and save the other bit, creating a little zone for human recreation, a little zone for bird habitats because it's a major flyover zone and so forth. And so what we began to ask is, could one actually look at some of these questions of hypersalinity as a kind of asset rather than a liability? And could one start to imagine an infrastructure that was not reliant on kind of massive engineering projects and huge capital, but actually on a much more incremental system that could respond to changing conditions? And so the project became a set of infrastructural pools that could both help remediate, help help regulate salinity and also introduce a kind of new form of public realm. So really, one of the things that interests us is, can architecture be entrepreneurial? And so if the current model of the Sultan was really, it's just a kind of aqueous dump, and really we get all our money from the Imperial Valley agricultural region, the argument was, could we sort of shift resources so that there was less reliance on a kind of highly water-intensive agriculture and an increased productivity in the Sultan, which would help, in fact, perhaps sustain some of the infrastructure costs. And so the question was also, how can the Sultan reintegrate into a kind of larger network? And so we were looking at the export of certain goods, the production of salt in a kind of return to its namesake, and then the kind of introduction back of tourism and recreation. Oh, and actually, so I will go back to this image for a moment. So really the project had four main components: the Salton Sea itself, a kind of new shoreline interface, a series of these infrastructural ponds, and then a kind of new land-based program that relied on less water-intensive systems. And so we developed a set of four pool types: a production pool that could harvest kelp and algae, which thrive in salt water, and also certain kinds of fish that thrive, habitat pools to support bird migration, harvesting pools that could produce small amounts of fresh water and also harvest salt, and recreation pools that would take advantage of different salinities for different activities. And so the idea is that the different pools had different widths and depths, and so of course the shallower the pool, the faster the evaporation. These pools could aggregate, so you could hybridize, for instance, an ecology pool with a salt harvesting pool and take the salt water to serve the kind of brine shrimp that would then attract more birds and so forth. And so the idea was that these pools could aggregate and could be towed in a way back to shore for servicing or to harvest them, and they would tap into a kind of land-based agriculture system that would look into saltwater greenhouses, the drying of the salt, and various other sort of land-based programs. And the other idea was that at the kind of mouth of the river that was bringing in all the toxins, there could be a set of basins that would remediate and remove a certain percentage of the toxins before they even got to the Sultan, so that you were catching a lot of them at their source. And then this is a view of the recreation zone with these different salinity pools. And so we looked at various technologies that already exist, floating wetlands, strategies for transporting large amounts of water, underwater fish farms, et cetera, as a way to kind of test whether this thing was even possible. And I think one of the things we're always interested in is trying to speculate across scale, so to see how does it work at a diagram, and then how are there technologies that one can equally employ to kind of implement and again sort of hybridize existing technologies. So really the argument was, can one shift from a mono-economy, in a sense, which is what the Imperial Valley was, to a much more complex set of economies that would be less reliant on a kind of single system. And at the same time, as I said, sort of, could infrastructure be adaptable? Could it be entrepreneurial? And could it produce a kind of new public realm, a kind of revisiting maybe of the TVA argument, where things like Lake Mead, when they were built, were also major recreation centers? So this project, I think, also showed an interest in thinking at a kind of territorial scale about architecture, and how, without necessarily building large things, could one think about acting on or having impact on a much larger territory. So the next project and set of ideas I want to talk about is related to this idea of wiring environment. I'm just going to see how I'm doing for time. So one of the things that I would say interests us is we tend to think of architecture sitting in an environment. And I think there's an interesting question of can architecture, can landscape actually be a producer of environments as well? And so we started by sort of asking, well, what is an environment when you look at the kind of dictionary definitions? And so there's the idea of, I won't read them all. But I particularly like number 3, which is all of the elements over which a designer has no control and that affect a system or its inputs and outputs. And I think that this idea, well, on the one hand, I think it's interesting to question what it means when one has no control, but on the other hand, to think about a kind of environment that acts in sort of dialogue with a kind of built environment. And one of the people that I think is sort of interesting in this respect is an early biologist named Jacob von Uexküll, who was writing in the 1930s, and he was looking at different species and looking at how species react to their environment, and basically started to observe that, well, he actually had, he sort of makes a specific distinction between environment and surroundings. And so he says that surroundings are everything, you know, around a given species, but that environment is only that which is productive to a species. And so he does these 2 sets of drawings. He did dozens, in fact. So this is one looking at a clam underwater. So the surrounding includes, of course, everything, but the environment is, in fact, the rock, because that is the thing that is productive to the clam. And similarly, in the second set of images, he's looking at a kind of environment from the perspective of a bee. And so the surroundings include everything, but the environment is only the kind of tops of the flowers that the bee can pollinate. And so this idea that environment is calibrated to the needs and complexities that it needs to respond to, I think is a sort of productive one. And so I'm going to talk quickly about 2 projects that maybe test this idea of sort of wiring environments. One was a project for a master plan, or an urban design, I should say, for a public space in Montreal. It was over the Ville-Marie expressway, which really severs the old city from the newer city. And so the plan, so the site is really this sort of trench that you see in the aerial. And there is the kind of old city hall, which you see over here with the very formal Champ de Mars, which was the kind of military parade grounds, and which represents maybe one kind of public space, which is highly choreographed, but not necessarily terribly used. And so the question of how one might envision a kind of large-scale public space that could work for many users, could work across seasons, and could sort of engage the public in many ways, became interesting as a kind of new form of civic space that sat somewhere between a park and a public space. And so one of the sort of early questions was, we're sitting on top of a highway, how might one capitalize on this? And we started to consider the fact that you have these, you know, hundreds or thousands, I should say, of cars and trucks that go under the tunnel every day, and the tunnel is, or the trench is slowly being covered up with public space and buildings. And so could one, through a series of micro turbines, actually harness the energy, essentially the kind of micro wind being produced by all these vehicles, to produce a net zero public space? And then the question is, how would one use this energy? And we got interested in this idea of producing a set of micro parks within the park. And so we conceived of the kind of public space in a way as a sort of dot matrix of several different systems that started to overlay. So there were a set of kind of urban components, different types of light systems, different canopies, trees, and then at a kind of slightly larger scale, mounds and bowls that could contain various programs. And so on the one hand, there was an idea of different temperature parks, so using the kind of energy from the microturbines to heat up certain zones and cool certain zones. So this was the kind of wiring diagram of a set of cooling and misting ponds that could cool certain parts of the park in the summer. Looking at sort of shaded parts of the park in the summer. Looking at different textures, so looking at hardscapes, softscapes, decking as producing a set of different environments throughout the park. Looking at lighting and different densities of lighting. And all of these would overlay essentially to produce different sort of parks within this larger environment. So here's the section of that sitting over the covered highway. And then the idea was really, going back to the original question, how could the park work through the season? So this was a view of it in the summer, a view of it in the fall, and then a view of it in the winter. So the ponds or the sort of bowls in the summer would act as sort of wading pools or splash pads, and in the winter could be filled with ice. A similar project that maybe asked these questions, it was a slightly earlier project, but asked many of these similar questions at a slightly larger scale, was a two-phase international competition that we worked on for the city of Reykjavik in Iceland. One of the things, of course, that many of you may know about Reykjavik, well, on the one hand, it's actually quite a small city, but it also sits on the whole nation sits on tremendous geothermal resources. And so this question of how can urbanism be productive, be entrepreneurial, how can systems sort of leverage each other, both to produce a kind of public realm and a productive realm, became a kind of foreground discussion in this project. So this is the city of Reykjavik. This is the older part of the city. And we started to look at three things that were sort of floating around discussions about Reykjavik. So one was, well, and I should say that the competition was for an old airport that had been built by the Americans in the war that was being decommissioned. And so the question of what to do with this huge swath of military infrastructure that was sitting just south of the city. So we looked at where there were decommissioned airports, where there was data farms, and where there was geothermal energy. And I will explain to you in a moment why we were looking at these things. So this is the site. So you see the kind of scale of the airport site in comparison. You're seeing pretty much all of the older Reykjavik. There's a little bit getting cut off there. And here's another view. So it gives you a sense of the scale of this. And of course, the challenge was it's hard to conceive of Reykjavik growing at a kind of rate that would justify this scale of master plan. But the competition sort of asked for a sort of 50-year vision for how this site might be developed. So we fell upon this drawing by Robert Smithson looking at different typologies of airports, and start to think about the idea of the airport as one kind of ecology, and could there be a new form of ecology or set of ecologies on this site. So we were interested in keeping in many ways the sort of figure or the kind of shadow of the runway rather than simply erasing it and building entirely over it. And so we began to talk about this idea of converting the runways into greenways. And the idea was that there were three distinctly different greenways, which I'll talk about in a moment. So there was one that connected the kind of old city down to a marina, which was a kind of ecological and civic greenway. There was a productive greenway that linked one of the only forested areas in the city to a small harbor, and then a kind of recreational greenway, which you see in pink, which serviced a set of schools and university campuses that already existed. And so the idea of how these different systems might coexist and as I say, leverage each other. So I'm going to skip over some of these. So this was the ecological and civic runway, or greenway, I should say, which in a way sort of was a gradient of different both landscape conditions and civic conditions. So there was an existing wetland and bird migration area, which we continued. There was a civic plaza that paired with an aviation museum. There was a botanical garden. There was, and then there was a port and marina, and each one of these sort of landscapes would be paired with a civic program. The productive one, or production runway, which was in a sense perhaps the kind of heart of the project, looked at leveraging the geothermal for several uses. So there's actually been a lot of discussion about companies like Yahoo and Google were looking to put server farms in Reykjavik because there's cheap energy. But of course, server farms produce vast amounts of wasted heat. And so the question became, what could leverage the kind of lost heat? And we started to look at greenhouses as something that was also starting to develop in the country. And so the idea was really a kind of stratum of data server farms below ground and a set of greenhouses and public markets above ground that basically acted in a kind of mutually reciprocal way. And so this was a kind of early study of how some of these systems might work. And then the last was a set of, as I say, the kind of recreation greenway, where each pocket became a kind of outdoor room and would either have berms up to protect it against wind or would be slightly sunken down to help create microclimates. So this was a kind of early view of the civic space where the three greenways intersect. This was a view of the sort of marina at the end of one of them. And this was the kind of grain of fabric. And so in the same way that there were different types of landscapes, we tried to look at different types of streetscapes and different types of building blocks, or urban blocks, I should say. And so we were always interested in this idea of a kind of urban porosity between the building and landscape. And so we developed systems of kind of porous perimeter blocks, an idea of a kind of stacked campus, because that was one of the programs, looking at a kind of plinth and folded bar, so that in each time there was a kind of openness between the building and its sort of context, and then a set of sort of pixel residential neighborhoods. And so again, this question of how one might kind of leverage systems that one wouldn't necessarily consider as being part of the original sort of a kind of typical sort of palette of architects' materials, but how one could start to look for untapped opportunities to imagine kind of new programmatic possibilities has been a kind of ongoing concern of ours. So the last, that's actually mislabeled, the last idea that I want to talk about is from site to territory. And it really stems from an argument that architecture, certainly in schools, but also I think among young professionals, is increasingly arguing to ally itself with landscape, with urban design, with ecology, but that if we are to do that in a kind of serious way, we need to start thinking about the site in which we are operating at similar scales. And so, if architecture typically looks at a fairly bounded condition of site, we may look at the kind of neighboring blocks to think of what is there in terms of massing or other programs, but it's a fairly constrained notion of where the site ends. Landscape architects, I would say, by definition, insofar as they're looking at hydrology and various other systems, are already looking at a kind of much larger scale. And infrastructure, of course, often works at a kind of territorial scale. And so this question of how one perhaps understands site, I think, is an interesting question. So there's a kind of GIS model, which was also embraced by people like Ian McHarg, who was an important landscape architect in the 60s, which understands site as a kind of series of systems that can be separated out. But I would say what's somewhat misleading about this image is that, of course, each of these different terms have their own boundaries. So the boundary of hydrology is entirely different than a social boundary or a political boundary or economic boundaries that happen in the environment. And so this question of site being a kind of highly fluid and multi-layered thing, and also I think a kind of three-dimensional condition, which I think is one of the powers maybe of the GIS, that site also includes the sort of airspace and the ground resources below. And so I would argue that if we are to think about these things, we need to shift from talking about site and really talking about architecture working at the scale of the territory. And I think that, this becomes evident, or some of the kind of problems of what a site is are rendered legible, for instance, when you look at the forces of globalization and you think about a Walmart store and you say, well, what is the site of the Walmart? Well, there's the physical site, but there's the entire infrastructural networks that support it, the highways, the distribution centers. Or similarly, if you look at a military base, how you define the kind of limits of that site are highly, I think, could be read in many ways. And similarly, when you're looking at ecology, for instance, if you're looking at toxicity, how do you define a site? Is it the source of the pollutants? So this question that, I think that the act of defining the site or territory of intervention is a kind of major act of design. So for instance, looking at caribou migration patterns as something that is highly in flux. So again, when you're looking at species, what is site is again sort of complexified. And one of the kind of, once you start to kind of unpack that, then the question is, well, how do you start to apprehend the territory? How do you grapple with it? How do you define its limits? And I think that the role of cartography and representation become, in fact, key. And one of the people that I think is most interesting in that respect is Buckminster Fuller, with, of course, his Dymaxion maps, where he, on the one hand, was trying to find new ways of literally representing the globe, but also, and it's rendered very evident here, recognize that how you represent things completely changes what you prioritize. So on the top, he leaves the land intact and allows the oceans to take up the kind of projective differential, and in the bottom, he leaves the oceans intact and the land masses take up the differential. And so this question of what you prioritize really changes, in a way, the kind of argument that you set out in the project. So I'm going to quickly talk about, well, or maybe not entirely quickly, that would be a lie, but try and move reasonably fast through a kind of ongoing project called Next North, which we've been working on for, I guess, 3 years or so. And it's actually a series of many projects. I'm going to talk incredibly quickly about 3 or 4 of them and try and spend a bit longer on 1 or 2 of them. So we got interested in the North for several reasons. We live in a country where we sort of celebrate the myth of the North as fragile and sublime and empty. And in fact, our observations as we started to research was that it is inhabited, it is monitored, there are infrastructures, there are all sorts of structures that are acts of inhabitation, essentially, in the North. It's a region that is, of course, undergoing dramatic transformations. 25% of the natural resources and in oil and gas are there, so there's huge developmental speculation. There's, of course, climate change, which is transforming access to those resources and also mobility and daily life. There's ongoing discussions about the presence of the Northwest Passage, although more and more people tell me that this is entirely fictive. And we have, of course, a prime minister who has taken a position of use it or lose it, that we have to kind of build and assert our sovereignty, and an argument that a lot of that construction should be military bases and research stations and deep sea ports. But many people would argue that the kind of, in fact, I think most scholars working in the North would say that the true challenges facing the North are social and cultural and economic. One of the other things that's fascinating is that it is an incredibly young population, particularly Nunavut, which has been a bit more of our focus. You've got 60% of the population under 25, and it's actually the fastest growing region in the country. I mean, it's tiny population-wise, but in terms of rate of growth, it's the fastest. So cities like Iqaluit are growing at 18% annually. So this is a view of Iqaluit, which is the capital city. And what becomes kind of clear in this image is that it is a region where not a lot of thought has been given to architecture for the most part, although there are certainly a few architects that are doing very good work there. And a region where architecture is driven by efficiency and expediency. So you've got, we now have 100,000 people living north of 60. Apart from the capitals, most are only a few thousand people, sometimes only a few hundred people. And these are some early figure grounds that we had done of some of the communities in the different territories. And so it gives you a sense of the scale that we're talking about. So when we started this research, the first question was actually, how do we start this? How do you look at 2.5 million square kilometers, given that we actually were by no means Arctic specialists in any way? And so we began by just sort of a very broad horizontal research, collecting news articles, collecting scholarly reports on issues of health, on issues of ecology, and so forth. And we found a way of tagging them and classifying them so that we could somehow track them. And we started to develop a set of data cards that were classified into 6 categories. So ecology, resources, monitoring, which included military and environmental monitoring, settlements as a category, and so forth. And so these research cards multiplied and multiplied, and they became a way for us to both bookmark things that seem to be important and things that seem to have some sort of spatial repercussion, but also started to allow us to think about where different things might intersect. So and one of the things that we have been working on as a kind of byproduct of that research, which will come out in 2014 with the Venice Biennale, which I'll talk about at the very end very quickly, is a book looking at the history of inhabitation in the Canadian North. So again, this essentially the same categories that we started with, and so we're looking at maps at different scales, territorial maps, looking at case studies. And it's really an argument also that inhabitation happens in many ways. So there's settlements, it happens at the scale of buildings. It happens, for instance, in the distance early warning system, which was, of course, built by the Americans in the 60s during the Cold War, and that those little dots have very real spatial conditions. Many of these sites are being mothballed and decommissioned, that there are icebreakers, that there are monitoring buoys, and that all these things are in a way forms of inhabitation, some obviously more tenuous than others, and so forth. So coming back to the project, when we were fortunate enough to get the Prix de Rome, we essentially said this was the opportunity to start moving from research to try and produce a set of design speculations. And I use that term specifically because the projects were purposely trying to respond to very tangible realities, but I would not necessarily say they would purport to solve problems. And I say that because I think many of these questions are so intricately complicated that no one project will solve the issue of health, or no one project will solve the issue of food security, but the projects were in a way provocations to say, what should architecture be thinking about? What are the questions we should be asking in this environment? So we produced an exhibition that had 6 projects. We recognized, I think, early on, and are trying to do this similarly in Venice, to try and document the North through many media. So we worked with a photographer that had been up to Cambridge Bay. We worked with a filmmaker. We produced maps. We produced calendars. We produced study models, and so forth. One of the first things we did was to make an installation that we called the active layer, which looked at the sort of amazing condition that the northern landscape undergoes every year of freeze and thaw. And I have to say, Cornelia Oberlander is in the room and has been very hugely inspiring and would be able to talk at much greater length about this, I suspect, than I will. So the landscape is one that oscillates between essentially a kind, in certain parts of the, in certain regions, from a kind of almost fluid state to a kind of frozen state. And what this means in terms of how one moves about the land, how one accesses certain resources is fascinating. And so, in fact, before we really began the work, we produced this sort of immersive installation that took a sample Arctic landscape and pixelized it into 20,000 points. Each height was actually a kind of reading off the landscape. And then this effectively became a kind of site model for a set of projects. Each project was located in very real sites, but the models became sort of hosted on this immersive sort of fluctuating landscape. So as I said, we produced 6 projects. I'm going to talk about the first 5 in literally 30 seconds each, hopefully. One was looking at, for instance, cultural infrastructure in the north. So we were looking at a region, let's see if I can get the map up. No. We were looking at a region in northern Quebec where every town is only 1,000 people, and so you can't imagine, building a cultural center for each of those towns. But if you start to conceive of them as a collection, a group, then to start to conceive of delivering cultural infrastructure became more feasible. And so we were thinking about the idea of the kind of library mobile in rural areas, and conceiving of a system of cultural in a way, boat hubs that could move from town to town in the summer when the ice was frozen, and that would then freeze into place along the ice-breaking routes. And so in the winter, you would snowmobile to the culture hubs, and in the summer, the infrastructure would come to you. We looked at rethinking sort of healthcare networks, and in fact, Mason is now on a grant with a kind of important Arctic researcher to look at this. The challenges, of course, in the north being that, actually one thing that I failed to say, which you probably know, but particularly in Nunavut, there are no roads. So the only way to get things from community to community is by boat for a short window in the summer, or by plane year-round. And so this complicates infinitely the delivery of buildings, the delivery of healthcare, the delivery of food, the delivery of everything. And so the mobility, in fact, becomes a subtext for almost all these projects. So in health right now, if you're sick, for the most part, you get sent south to Winnipeg, to Ottawa. So if you, for instance, if you need a C-section, that would be the equivalent of one of us being sent, to remote Yukon. So the kind of social dislocations that produces is huge. And so we start to look at, could one rethink a kind of a network of medical hubs that might be much more local and actually would hybridize the hospital and the airport into a kind of new type. Another one looking at the role of research stations and how they might be located more strategically along certain species, in this case caribou migration routes, to address certain challenges and so forth. So I don't want to, this one was looking at iceberg tourism that happens off the coast of Newfoundland. There's a small town called Twillingburg that explodes from 5,000 people to 25,000 people every year who go and see the icebergs. It's also where the Coast Guard is located. And so again, looking at, could there be an infrastructure that serves the tourism industry and the Coast Guard and a research space simultaneously. So the project, so these were these sort of sets of projects, and the one that I'm going to spend a little bit longer on is called the Arctic Food Network, and it is a project that we are now trying to work with the government of Nunavut to see if we can prototype. And it really began with a kind of observation about the relationship between food, mobility, and culture. One of the realities in the north is that food is there's an increasing loss in hunting traditions, particularly among the youth, and there's an increasing reliance on southern food that is imported. And of course, shipping food to the north is exorbitantly expensive. So apples cost 4 times what they cost here. You know, mushrooms cost literally 10 times what they cost here. And you couple that with incredibly high unemployment, and the effect is that people are eating Twinkies and baked beans and incredibly unhealthy things, and you have high rates of diabetes and heart issues and so forth. And so the question wasn't how do we, you know, entirely return to traditional hunting patterns. And in a way, none of these projects, I think all these projects argue that I don't think there's any going back, but how can one take traditional cultures and practices and hybridize them with contemporary technologies and contemporary systems and produce something that is much more responsive to the kind of realities of the North, both geographically, culturally, and environmentally. So there's still a tradition of going out onto the land and hunting, of ice fishing, and so forth. And this is a kind of very long tradition. This is actually a photo in northern Quebec, but you would get similar views in although not quite so dense, in Nunavut of ice fishing cabins. And these are the amazing seal hole, hunting holes. So on the one hand, there's this challenge of food. On the other is the kind of amazing network of trails that exist throughout Nunavut, and particularly in Baffin, which has a concentration of about 23,000 people. And so we worked with an anthropologist at Carleton, who's now at Dalhousie, called Claudio Porta, who had been mapping the traditional Inuit trails. And we also began looking at what infrastructures already existed to sustain the production of food in the north. So there's underground, there's a historic tradition of underground ice freezers. There's the cabins that you saw. There's some communities starting to build greenhouses. There are community freezers that are in fact essentially just giant steel boxes that are now leaking chemicals and costing communities millions of dollars just to maintain, and as you can see, don't really contribute much to a kind of collective realm. And so the question of where architecture might intervene in all of this, we looked at systems of mobility as well. And we began to basically ask, would there be a network of structures that could intersect with the location of communities, the location of food sources, and the location of these Inuit trails? And could one start to envision a kind of system of trade and sharing between communities such that one would be able to augment each community's access to traditional, or what they call country food? So we began by mapping where one had access to various food groups. We charted everything that we could find that is consumable, and there's much more than one thinks. There's berries and obviously seafood and mammals that are hunted, and started to basically map the calendar of when one has access to these food groups at present, which is the solid colors, and then the kind of extended hatch was us trying to speculate on how these structures might extend the calendar of access. So obviously greenhouses, you could grow certain berries longer. In a collective kitchen, you could smoke and dry and conserve things. In a trading post, you could share and exchange goods. And there's a long tradition of sharing food among families and among communities. And so again, in terms of a kind of economic argument, it was also a question of, if the current model is one of largely importing southern food, sorry, these are always flipped. This is the present condition, this is the future. So the present condition is one of importing southern foods, and the cost of food gets higher as you go north. The question became, could one imagine a system that was more reliant on a kind of internal trade and might even produce some products that are actually exported? So there might be a kind of microeconomies that are produced. So we developed a set of structures which we classified into four groups. So stacks that included collective kitchens, markets and greenhouses, and smoking cabins. We looked at vaults that would be for storage of food. We looked at meshes that might allow you to harvest certain aquaculture, and poles that could be for Wi-Fi and lighting for wayfinding. And it's actually a significant issue. There are dozens of people every year that die getting lost going out into the land hunting. So, and one of the reasons I should say that we developed this sort of perhaps exhaustive set of structures was to envision a system that could respond to different communities' needs. So a thought that, one community might say, well, we'd like 2 hunting cabins out in our national park, and another community might say, well, we'd like a collective kitchen in a market, and another community might, And so the idea that the system could respond to what communities actually wanted and needed. And so we're very much in a phase of getting and feedback on these and recalibrating them. So this was a kind of initial view of how they might aggregate in a community. And we looked at different locations they might aggregate. So in a town, what we call just outside of a town. So for instance, in Iqaluit, there's a national park, and some people said, oh, it would be interesting to have 1 or 2 structures at the kind of gates of the national park, and then really out in the land, and those would be smaller structures. So this was a view in the community. This was a view of a set of structures just outside of town. This was a view of one of these, the interior view of a collective kitchen where food could be prepared and stored. And then out in the land, a view of a small fishing cabin. And so one of the things that interested us also was the building technology. So if the project at a kind of larger scale is asking how might traditional practices merge with contemporary practices, recognizing that the snowmobile has entered, that trade has begun, and so forth, could the building technology similarly serve as a kind of hybrid? And so, and we were interested in developing a system that was easily erectable and could be done by the community. And so we, on the one hand, we're looking at joints that might be CNC'd, but then the rest of the structure could be very standard lumber. We looked at an envelope on the one hand that was solar panels, and there's a lot of research and testing and implementation of solar panels in the north, although it's not without its issues. And on the other hand, imagining that the sidewalls could be snowpacked, so that in the winter they would be fully insulated, and in the summer you might have a tarp to simply cut the wind. So the idea that the building would merge these two sort of ideas of technology and construction and react seasonally. And also how it might then get built. So especially when you're out in the land, you can't deliver it by boat, you can't deliver it by road, and so it would be put on sleds, on 2 or 3 sleds, and built by a group of 3 to 4 people. So this was a very early view of it. This is a slightly more recent view of one of these clusters just outside a community. And we developed community consultation toolkits to try and find ways that might be more intuitive about how to kind of describe the project and then equally get feedback. So we built a set of small, basically sort of almost chess pieces of all the different structures, so that community members could say, well, we'd like one of these, and could be overlaid on a map of the community. And similarly, a kind of toolkit for how we thought the structure might work to get feedback. And undoubtedly, we will get told that there's a whole host of things that need to be rethought. How am I doing? I have one more project. I can either, maybe I'll try and blast through it. One of the most recent projects, which is certainly more speculative than the Arctic Food Network, but also has become a testing ground for our work in Venice, was a project called Knowledge Clouds. And it looked at the idea of a University of the an Arctic university, because there is a University of the Arctic. And it began with a very basic observation that Canada is the only circumpolar country without a university in its Arctic. Also a recognition that there are many types of knowledge being created and existing in the North, but they are not necessarily intersecting and exchanging as one might, to the extent that one might hope. And I'll come back to that in a moment. So these two types of knowledge, on the one hand, you have dozens and dozens, if actually hundreds, of researchers studying everything from glaciology to caribou migration to toxicity of the Arctic oceans that are traveling up to the north. Many universities have research stations. I can't remember, I think this is McGill's, but I could be wrong. That basically set up in the middle of, I'll say nowhere, I mean they're probably instrumental to where their research is, but that have no potential to really have a productive feedback with, let's say, community members. And you have this sort of network of the University of the Arctic, which is a network of universities all around the world, largely circumpolar universities, although not always, which is a very ephemeral network. And this idea of an ephemeral education network became interesting to us, and I will come back to it. And on the other hand, you have, of course, have a deep knowledge base in the elders, who have profound understanding of climate change, of ecology, of species, et cetera. And so part of the question became, could one envision a curriculum? Could one envision a model of buildings that would that would be responsive, that could react to the kind of realities of the North, which is that, you know, when you don't have a single town more than 27,000, and that's Whitehorse, and in Nunavut, your biggest town is 7,000 with Iqaluit. The idea of building a kind of traditional campus as we know it is impossible. There aren't the resources there to justify it, really. And so it became for us a question of, could one imagine a model of education that might be distributed, that might be literally mobile, and that could respond to curricular demands and also teaching opportunities and learning opportunities. And this is the high school in Iqaluit, which actually we're quite fond of. It's a kind of crazy building known as the Marshmallow Building. But it does speak to a certain also hermeticism about that was prevalent in the 70s. So as with so many of our projects, one of the questions became, how could one leverage existing systems? And there's a lot of talk in the mining industry of using dirigibles to transport goods because you can only use the ice roads in the winter. And there are literally entire conferences dedicated to it. So on the one hand, this looks entirely science fiction, but this is actually in significant discussion by all the mining industries as to whether this is a viable option. And so the question became, could we leverage this system of dirigibles or blimps that would already be serving the mining industries, and they could also serve our education network. And so we looked at essentially the idea for part of the campus of deployable classrooms that would really be for field studies. And so they could be taken from one community to the other and aggregate. You could get 2 or 3, and they could stay for a period of 3 months, they could stay for a period of a year, they could stay for a period of only a few weeks. And so we were looking at this idea of a sort of Arctic university that might have certain subregions, so certain clusters that might work within the Western Arctic, Central, and the Western, Eastern Arctic. And the project also became a vehicle for thinking about how to represent architecture within a kind of dynamic environment. And so so this was an exhibition that we mounted at Harborfront. And as with all our projects, we really wanted to look at the architecture at 2 scales, at a kind of territorial scale, and then at the scale of a community, and then at the scale really of building technology. So this was the kind of model that we produced. On the upper left. You see the kind of territorial map, which I'll talk about in a moment, and then in the foreground you see the architectural scale models. So the territorial map was really, actually I should back up and say that, so what we were interested in doing is producing physical models that would of course be static, but project onto it through animations all the information about the environment that was dynamic. So anything that was changing would be projected and animated. So in the territorial scaled model, we showed where, we treated it like a sort of X-ray scan. So we were showing where tree line was, where permafrost was, where communities were. This was where all the research stations, here were the communities and their relative sizes. Here was the kind of network, and so it was all animated where different classrooms might move relative to different curricula happening. And similarly at the kind of architectural scale, projecting things like wind or the accumulation of snow or ice or species migrating or snowmobiles moving. And then at the scale of the sort of building envelope, again looking at sort of existing technology. So we were looking at lightweight, I was going to say PV skins, but that's not the right word. I'm blanking. PVs, yes, that were flexible. And then on the other hand, looking at materials like eider duck as an insulative material, and that is also being developed in one of the communities as a kind of test material, so that these things could, of course, fold up and then deploy. And so the sort of constituent elements were this platform, because of course everything or in most regions of the north has to be raised off the ground because of permafrost, a kind of deck, the structure that acted like an umbrella, and then the insulative cladding that was flexible. And the idea that the platform could serve several roles, that you could, so you would store, equipment during the field research underneath, and then the classroom would be above and could sort of glow like a lantern at night and in the winter. So I'm going to end literally with a 3-minute discussion on our most recent ongoing project, which we're very proud to have UBC involved in, which is called Arctic Adaptations. We're the curators for the Canadian Pavilion for the 2014 Venice Biennale, and it's really a team venture. So we are working with 5 schools of architecture, 5 firms that are either based in the north or working extensively in the north, and 5 Nunavut organizations. And we're looking essentially at the role of architecture in Nunavut, which is celebrating its 15th anniversary in 2014. So it seemed a kind of auspicious moment to look back, but also really to look forward. So again, this idea of sort of projecting forward where architecture might go. And we're looking at across 5 themes: recreation, health, housing, education, and the arts. Each team consists of a team of students, an architect, and a Nunavut organization that acts as a kind of advisor with deep knowledge on the ground relative to these issues. So these are the Nunavut organizations. Venice, as you know, is a kind of we've been told it was like the Olympics of architecture. We weren't too keen on that description, but certainly a kind of major sort of expo of architecture. Canada is one of only 30 countries that have a national pavilion located on the Biennale grounds. It's a very quirky building, which is proving to have challenges in and of its own right. It's a kind of shell-shaped building with a courtyard and 2 trees going through it in the middle. And so the ambitions of the project are really to, on the one hand, describe a kind of immersive installation that describes, through photography, through films that we hope to make with Nunavut filmmakers, through soundscapes, the kind of, I would say, visceral realities of the kind of built landscape of Nunavut. And then the second component, which is a set of models that the teams, each of the 5 teams will produce 3 sets of models, again, at these kind of at different scales, so looking at the territorial and the architectural. And so this idea of these dynamic models that we were testing in the knowledge clouds, we hope to pursue in Venice. This was a very, very early rendering of it. So we've been running competitions in 5 schools. UBC ran some fantastic curriculum over the course of the summer. We juried it in August. These were some of the entries. UBC was looking at questions of health, so there were some amazing entries. This is the jury with the selected team, and Jeffrey Cox and, I'm going to forget your name, Aspinall. Yes, with Gwen Healy, who was the Nunavut partner on health, Gino Pin, and Simon Taylor from Yellowknife, who are the architects working on it. So, and we have evidence, we are sending all the students who are selected to the north, so this is evidence that they were sitting overlooking Iqaluit and getting experience firsthand. We have an amazing advisory council of northerners, of southerners, of architects, of politicians, of public figures, and so forth. We have many sponsors, and we are on an ongoing fundraising campaign, and if anyone wants to hear more about the project, I'm happy to talk about it separately. I'm going to end maybe just by saying that I think our interest really is in perhaps expanding the role of the architect, and we were talking about this a bit earlier today, that we often, as a discipline or as a profession, come at the end of a process. So there is a client who has chosen a site and a program, and the question of whether the architect can come in sort of earlier in the process and actually act really as a kind of detective for opportunities and possibilities that others have overlooked. And I think that you know, part of the reason I feel confident in advocating for that is that I think we have immense capabilities as a profession. We think synthetically, we think across a range of issues, social, political, economic, technological, and there are very few disciplines that I think can do that. And so I think any way that we can sort of harness those skills and perhaps sort of expand the territory in which we can operate has, at least for us, been very thought-provoking. I will end it there. Thank you.